Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, we'll be discussing the Downing Street garden party, life after COVID, the lab leak theory, and whether it's racist to call a black person eloquent. So this week, evidence emerged of yet another lockdown-busting garden party in Downing Street. This is probably the government's lowest point yet, I would say. Boris Johnson is really on the rocks, very struggling to fend off the accusations of rule breaking, struggling to account for his behaviour. Tom, what have you made of it?
No, you're right. I think it feels like the wheels are starting to come off at this point. I mean, we've been treated to sort of one scandal after another, COVID rule breaking related or not, over the course of the past few months. But I think this one feels very different. I think it even feels different from the other rule breaking scandals that have happened so far, which were becoming increasingly tiresome, borderline, a question of a Zoom quiz here or a few drinks at your desk there. This feels a little bit different, I think, because of the fact that it was in the middle of the first lockdown, when not only were the restrictions so tight, but also there was so much kind of fear, you know, in the population and concern and all the rest of it. You know, the fact that this was kind of prearranged, that it was basically just sort of piss up in the garden, that Boris Johnson definitely attended it himself, that whilst he claimed at PMQs this week that it was a work event, I mean, he brought his wife along to it for some reason. So all of these things just seem to be a kind of insult to our intelligence. And just the details, you know, the fact that 40 minutes before this thing kicked off, you had Oliver Dowden doing the number 10 briefing, reminding people that they could only meet one person outside. I mean, this is just taking everyone for fools at this point. Now, this kind of lockdown rule moralism, which the media have been particularly gripped by, is something that hasn't really affected us. It takes a lot for us to condemn COVID rule breaking, but there just comes a point where you feel like this is just holding people in contempt right now.
Yeah.
I think we've reached that point. You know, a couple of days afterwards, Johnson was giving one of these press conferences where one member of the public asked what she should do because she keeps coming across people meeting bunches of people in the park. And he said that she should try to confront them or call the police.
Yeah.
You know, there's just a point at which this becomes incredibly galling. And I think it also speaks to just the contempt that the government and their rules held us in, because they knew even back then that having people around for socially distanced drinks, particularly amongst youngish and healthy-ish people, was no big deal. But they wouldn't let us do that.
Yeah.
Because the panic was, of course, they'll get too carried away. They won't remember there's a pandemic on. We can't trust them. So I think it just becomes another example of that. And I think, you know, those plunging approval ratings, Labour's got its highest poll lead for since 2013. I mean, it really does feel like this is incredibly serious. And without wanting to try and make any predictions, it's hard to see how Johnson himself can recover from this at this point.
Yeah. Ella, what have you made of the attempts by Boris to sort of wriggle out of this? I mean, first there was a whole day where the government was essentially saying, well, let's defer to this investigation, which, you know, was absurd. We know they were there and they were saying, we want someone to investigate whether we were there. And now this kind of excuse, oh, I thought it was a work event, you know, coming to a party accidentally almost. What do you make of that?
Well, that non-apology was, like, some people have commented about this on Twitter, the most lawyered piece of text you could ever read. Every single word was chosen very specifically. You know, the use of the word implicitly, I implicitly thought this was a work event or whatever it was, is so snakish. It's really, you know, Tom's right. It's taking us for fools. And I go as far as to say it's a kind of barefaced lie, because if you have a situation in which, you know, someone so senior as the sender of that email could send around an email, not just like gossip goes around the office and you hear there's a party, or you hear that people are going to go out for a cigarette and a drink in the garden or something, you know, not formal like that, but an actual invite sent out to 100 people. You know, if you know that that's, even if Boris Johnson wasn't the orchestrator of that event, you know that that's happened within your workplace, there's no ground for you to stand on. And I don't necessarily, you know, I don't think a grovelling apology from Boris Johnson or even a resignation would satisfy me at this point, because I think that while I am furious with the Conservative Party, and I think it's disgusting that they were, you know, celebrating the fact that police officers were driving across Hackney Downs, where I live, with a loud hailer shouting at people, go home, you know, people who were sat alone reading a book in the sunshine, trying to find a bit of joy in what was a very miserable situation. But I think I'm even angrier with the Labour Party and the Lib Dems coming in now and trying to suggest that they have the moral high ground in relation to this, because everyone seems to have forgotten that the terrible thing is not that Boris Johnson and Carrie went to a party in a garden. The terrible thing was that, as you say, Tom, we were unnecessarily all living through this fear and anxiety that had been pumped out from government. I mean, the crucial point was, in the 20th of May, lots of us still didn't know what was going on. I mean, the fear was genuine.
Yeah.
We didn't have all the data. We didn't have the vaccine. We didn't have any of the things we have today. And so it was quite a frightening time. But so much of the messaging coming out of government was saying the reason we need to be severe is because we can't really trust you. The reason we need to put in all these crazy restrictions, like, have the Derbyshire police running around arresting people on mountainsides and swimming
flying
in lakes.
drones over people.
Is not because the virus is really dangerous when you're sat alone on a bench, but because we have to set this kind of blanket rule, otherwise the public will go crazy. And the Labour Party in particular not only went along with that, but actually pushed the government time and again to go further, to bring in more restrictive policies. And so the idea that Keir Starmer and members of his cabinet can now get up and kind of smirk and attack the government as if they're speaking on behalf of the public, I think that boils my blood more than as Tom says, yet another scandal of yet another party in number 10. At this point, they were probably doing it all the time. I mean, you end up feeling a bit cynical.
Far, isn't there? In relation to the government. So.
I mean, the media and the opposition have been using this as an opportunity to remind people of the privations of lockdown. We've been reminded of the stories of socially distanced funerals, people not being able to see dying relatives. But I mean, it feels a bit cheap, doesn't it, Tom? Especially when, all of those people supported the rules that allowed that to happen.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as ever, they're upset about the rule breaking and a sense of alleged sort of fairness rather than the obvious inhumanity of the rules themselves. I mean, people not being allowed to spend a close relative's dying moments with them for what? The fear they give that person COVID? I mean, it's just ridiculous when you really think about it. Socially distanced funerals where very few people are able to attend these kind of incredibly tight restrictions, all of the school stuff, I think as someone's pointed out, back in that period, there was all this kind of nervousness about letting primary school children go back. Such was the level of kind of threat. And on certain restrictions, you almost see it piece by piece. People say, in retrospect, the schools thing was crazy, or this was really damaging. And yet there's still a lot of people who are still not really necessarily making the connection. I think that's one thing that could be a bit of a danger, is that, again, the obsession with rule breaking just sort of force fields the rules themselves from scrutiny. But I think there is an element of people waking up to it. At the same time, I think the rule breaking itself still feels significant, I guess, because a lot of what we talked about so far was people in public life kind of bending or breaking the rules, either in a way that kind of everyone did, or a kind of sense of it was hard not to after a certain period of time, or there was things that people could understand, or they were kind of individual. But there's something about this government, this alleged people's government, locking everyone down and then starting to throw parties, which just has this kind of Versailles feel to it, which I think is important and shouldn't escape anyone's notice. But I completely agree, Ella, about this point about those rules being purposely ridiculous. I mean, it's that whole kind of, if we give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And it's what is so strange about that is that it flies in the face of what happened throughout the pandemic.
Yeah.
People locked themselves down before there was a lockdown, all the mobility data plunges. Remember when we reopened in July 2020, there was all this talk from police and NHS leaders that they were preparing for like New Year's Eve on speed, and there's just going to be this kind of wave of drunkenness and violence, and then probably COVID as a result of that. None of that actually materialized. All these really stupid rules, like you need to eat when you go to the pub, which was purely bred of a kind of sense of, if we just let them go to the pub, they're just going to get smashed and kiss each other, and then this is going to be disastrous.
Lick strangers,
social distancing will break down. Stuff like, at various points, you were allowed to meet people outside, but not in your own garden for fear of what? They go and use the toilet. Like this kind of like really persnickety, almost like paternalism, was bred of contempt at the end of the day, but one that completely wasn't earned because people did take this pandemic seriously. So you just come to the conclusion that whilst we do need to focus on the rules and getting rid of them and having a proper reckoning with the past 2 years, because there's going to be an awful lot of people who are going to try and rewrite history, who will just pretend that they were aware of these problems to begin with, or just try and ignore a proper discussion about the role that various people have played in bringing about maintaining lockdown and giving it almost kind of completely perfect moral legitimacy, which is always quite strange. But at the same time, I think there is really something to be said about this government and how, despite claiming to be different, has revealed itself in quite a profound way to be as contemptuous of ordinary people as any of its predecessors, really. I don't think that should escape our attention either.
We at Spiked are always looking to expand our knowledge, to learn something new, and to get to grips with all the madness that's happening in the world around us. That's one of the many reasons we love Wondrium. Wondrium is the place for everyone who's ever wondered about anything. With the end of the pandemic in sight, we've been thinking about what makes a health crisis a crisis. When should we listen to experts, and when should we push back against them? And of course, there's the role of the media that is always worth interrogating. One program that really gets to grips with these subjects is The Skeptic's Guide to Health, Medicine and the Media on Wondrium. The series is presented by Dr. Roy Benarock, who, over the course of 24 episodes, gives you all the tools you need to challenge the media's fear-mongering and its promotion of quackery. Dr. Benarock explores a whole range of medical controversies, from alternative medicine to ideas around good fats and bad fats, and he takes a look at the opioid crisis that America is currently mired in. It's a fascinating series, and we think you'll love it too. Wondrium's vast curated library covers just about every subject: science, history, music, language, travel, religion, health, business, and on and on and on. Its teachers, professors, and experts will inspire you to keep on learning new things every day. It's so easy to watch and listen to Wondrium's programs. I turn on Wondrium at home to watch on my computer, and then I can pick up where I left off on my phone by using the Wondrium app. Wondrium really is the ideal learning companion. If I know Spike's listeners, I know you're curious people who are always looking to learn new things, so you're definitely going to love Wondrium. So check out The Skeptic's Guide to Health, Medicine and the Media, and then have a look at the thousands of other videos Wondrium has to offer. Right now, Spike's listeners can get a special free 22-day trial offer to celebrate the new year. To get it, you need to sign up through our special URL, which is wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. That's wondrium.com/spiked. Start learning today. We should talk a bit about the current COVID situation. It feels as if, looking at the data, it seems as if a lot of people are saying that the Omicron wave has peaked. It's nothing close to what the SAGE advisors were projecting. And we've done that without restrictions. There's hope that even the Plan B restrictions might be lifted towards the end of the month. The isolation period has been cut. But are we really out of the woods yet in terms of this kind of these restrictions on liberties, do you think, on the broader kind of culture that has turned against freedom?
I think we're actually in a really weird stage of limbo where almost everyone now realizes that Omicron wasn't the deadly threat that it was going to be. It's kind of like people on the street and, behind closed doors say, yeah, well, that wasn't really that much. There wasn't that much of a fuss. And you have sort of quiet changes in the tone of the way in which cabinet ministers talk about it. There's lots of people now, MPs are saying we need to live with this virus. You've had that kind of phrase slowly coming back in. But the reason it's in limbo is because no one is, despite the fact that we're supposed to be living in this time where facts are all important and data is king and, we're led by the science and all of that, there is a real reluctance among, the government, but also other people, commentating scientists who have been sort of commentators on this throughout, to quite definitively say, looking at the period of December to now, we're relatively confident that this thing isn't what we thought it was going to be. God forbid they say we were wrong. Certainly, SAGE scientists say we were wrong about predicting that there would be 6,000 deaths a day, and make clear the distinction between cases and deaths, because I think that's the most important thing that Omicron has provided. The knowledge of why an increase in case rates is different to an increase in death rates. That's why Delta was very different to Omicron. And the problem is, if you remain in that limbo, you never get to hold to account government restrictions, which are political restrictions rather than scientific necessities. we still have things happening, for example, in care homes where people are still not allowed to see their relatives, freely. It's still not treated as a home that you can invite whoever you like into. There are still this rigmarole of either wearing excessive PPE or having to see people through windows. You've had, we were just talking about the 20th of May, got all these people sharing stories about how they had to speak to their mother who had dementia through a window. That's still happening to people today. We've still forgotten about, haven't been able to address the problem with elderly people and how they've been abused throughout the last 2 years. But there are still things on the statute books that need to be removed. The government hasn't yet, despite Freedom Day and all of that, the government hasn't taken that step to say normality has returned. And so if you continue in this limbo, the danger is that you never address it, that you never actually say it's over now. And it's always held as a kind of threat over the public that if this returns, or even, some people talking about why don't we use some of the things we've learned over the last 2 years for flu or things like that, that you never really are fully free. And that has very real ramifications for people's lives. Yeah,
no, I think it's that, as Brendan wrote about this on Spike this week, but it's not simply about it's also not simply about the kind of rules being lifted, or stopping testing, mass testing, which obviously continues to create that kind of sense of fear and all the rest of it, or cutting the isolation days or getting rid of isolation, all the rest of it. I mean, all of that is good and we would like that to happen, but at the same time there's this issue with this sort of culture, as you were sort of gesturing to earlier, just being completely gone and needing to be kind of rebuilt from the ground up. It feels like people's kind of confidence in being out in society. I mean, we've been expected to, in a sense, just kind of forego our own judgment and hand that over to the government in all these situations because they didn't trust us to do it for ourselves. So you had to outsource your own kind of judgment, your own risk assessment, as it were, to officialdom. Also, the last 2 years has just bred a profound suspicion of one another, which is really corrosive to a free society, because it's not just about the individual. You also need to kind of trust other individuals. You need to be sort of comfortable in one another's company. We've been encouraged to see each other as vectors of disease, really, for so long, threats to our own health and the health of our families. I mean, this is something which is going to take a long time to unwind. And it's something which is something that, again, is not just going to sort of snap back, I think is important to say. And then on the other hand, as we've already sort of been talking about, you just really hope there'll be some sort of reckoning as well with the sort of political part of this, which is the relationship between sort of expertise and politics, which in the past couple of weeks, I think it's been really fascinating. Like Carl Hennigan makes this point on Brendan's podcast this week, which talks about, this is probably the first instance in which the government kind of broke the link between the expert advice, the sage advice, and the policy. And they were vindicated in doing so. Every other time the government might have been accused of dragging its feet or whatever, but there was still obviously a big wave to deal with. You could always say, well, the projections might have been off, but it was quite serious. SPI-M were predicting potentially 6,000 daily deaths of the Omicron wave. We haven't reached 200 for almost a year.
Yeah.
This is so crazy. And I think it just really demonstrates that, again, just how much expertise is not a straightforward proposition. It's subject to groupthink. It's subject to its own political pressures and back covering and all the rest of it. And I think on the kind of political side of getting rid of the new normal, if you like, is something that will have to reckon with that as well. Because surely at this point, most people will start to see the problems that have been clear throughout, but never quite been as glaring until the Omicron wave, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's the case that SAGE were essentially, or the modelling people in SAGE were saying that the Omicron wave was going to be the worst of the virus yet, despite the vaccination program and the boosters, despite it being inherently milder.
Yeah.
I mean,
And they'll say, obviously, this was a projection, not a prediction, blah, blah, blah. But anyone who could read those headlines, everyone knew what role that was playing as far as trying to push the government in a certain direction, whether it was, unthinking or not. It's just obvious to anyone what that the consequence of all of that was.
And that's only one side of the kind of democratic deficit there's been in this. And you kind of gestured earlier, Ella, to the Coronavirus Act and to this kind of rule by decree as well that we've had throughout this crisis. I mean, there's something there that we have to really challenge as well going forward too?
Yeah, because we're now in a situation in which if you call something an emergency, you greenlight the government to be able to take, steps in relation to law, take steps in relation to regulation with very little parliamentary scrutiny, if any, and kind of make it it's a way of sort of moral grandstanding and seeking authority within the government, that if you say we're dealing with this emergency, then it looks like you're really doing something. You can see it happening in relation to other aspects of public health, whether it be, rules, things that we love talking about, like rules on smoking, rules on obesity and things like that, but also in relation to the supposed emergency of the climate emergency, and means through which government will bypass any kind of democratic engagement to tackle the emergency of the world ending. And so you can see how it's going to have various problems, throughout different areas of political life if you allow the idea of an emergency to completely take over the proper running of politics. But I think the point that Tom makes about, and that Brendan makes in his article about the other aspects of how life has changed is really important and isn't often talked about. I mean, I was on a bus the other day and this woman was choking on a bit of her sandwich, just kind of had gone down the wrong pipe and was coughing. And everyone on the bus was looking at her horrified and flinching. And then when I reached over to give her a clap on the back and get it out, she flinched. And you just think, Jesus, this is bizarre that we've gotten to the point where people are still flinching from each other. And the question is, how do you start to change that? Because as Tom's right that, just if Boris Johnson came out and said, oh, it's Freedom Day, it's all over, that wouldn't necessarily have the kind of social effect that you might want it to have. All these things are not going to be cured overnight, but they also reflect a kind of, I think the period of the pandemic has been a sort of eye-opener to trends that have been happening for a very long time, kind of atomization throughout society, people being alienated from each other. We don't even have to look to like the kind of mask culture in China and stuff like that. There has been a kind of a anti-human trend in relation to the environment and other things of seeing people as sort of icky kind of, you don't want to get into nightclubs with each other, you don't want to do any dangerous things. And so tackling that kind of misanthropy that has fed throughout the pandemic is going to be a real challenge, one I think that's doable, but it's not going to happen overnight.
And the technocracy as well as the misanthropy, I think, because that's one thing which particularly the kind of elites are taking the pandemic as a great vindication for technocracy, for rule by expert, which is ridiculous when you think about some of the things we were just talking about, as well as the fact that, the European Union has not made a very good fist of it, shall we say, at various different points. But still, the narrative becomes this. And also, you kind of naturally, I think, through this kind of period, you see a sense in which that view starts to get burnished. These YouGov Guardian polls that they've been running for a few years, asking countries across Europe, how much do you believe that the will of the people should be the sort of main principle in a democracy or whatever? And they're seeing it sort of start to decline. You feel like, again, also just any of that kind of insurgent energy has just had the life sapped out of it. And particularly in the UK, the one kind of big electoral vehicle for it in the form of Boris Johnson's Conservatives has kind of collapsed under the weight of its own, bullshit at this point. So that's going to be the other thing, I think, is just trying to rebuild that very positive, very exciting sort of democratic mood that was really kind of reaching an interesting point before the pandemic, before everyone got locked in their houses and away from one another. So that's going to be another thing that'd be worth reviving, definitely.
So new emails have emerged this week that have reignited the debate on the origins of COVID-19. Now, the so-called lab leak theory, this idea that COVID may have emerged from a lab, possibly accidentally, rather than from an animal source, has always been controversial. It's been talked about as a conspiracy theory. It's been suppressed by big tech. But now we know that a lot of top scientists actually gave it a lot more credence in private than they did in public. And it seems as if there were political reasons potentially for poo-pooing it. Tom, what have you made of this?
No, so Matt Ridley wrote about this on Spike for us this week, and also has a great book that he's co-authored out called Viral about this whole lab leak saga. But it's just so fascinating. So these emails have been uncovered by these kind of Republican congressmen in America between various leading scientists, Jeremy Farrar and the Wellcome Trust, and various others back in February 2020, just talking about how they thought it was quite a high probability that this could have come from a lab because of its particular qualities and all the rest of it. And yet, as Matt points out, a month later, some of these guys are signing this letter in The Lancet condemning the very thing they said was probable a month earlier as a contemptible conspiracy theory. And as you say in these emails, just talking about how this could affect international harmony was one of the lines from one US official. Other discussions about this could harm science in general and science in China in particular. And, just a general concern that this if this was be able to talk about openly, that it would have some sort of horrendous impact and all the rest of it. And it just, again, all the things that we've been talking about, throughout the pandemic, we've heard so much about the science. You have various scientific and official institutions kind of really claiming that mantle as just the kind of ultimate unbiased arbiters of what needs to be done. But it's just a perfect demonstration about how even these people are subject to these political pressures. And it's just made perfectly clear in this particular kind of trove of emails that's been uncovered.
Ella.
The kind of irony of it is that one of the scariest things throughout the pandemic was this idea that the way in which the virus had come to pose us such a threat was kind of you couldn't understand it, and it was this almost like fatalistic thing that it had happened through some kind of force of nature, even through animals or some kind of genetic mutation or whatever, and that this idea that it was just going to happen again, it was just going to become part of our lives. That was the kind of thing that freaked me out most, was that there was not going to be any end to this. And when you look
at a bat and a pangolin this time,
it'll be some other kind of combination
dormouse
next
and a kangaroo
time.
Next time, whatever.
And forever and ever and ever. And actually, if the scientists really thought this and thought that it was a mistake, that's actually much more reassuring, because you just think, right, well, we need better lab security. If this is a human mistake, you can put things in place to fix it and also prevent it next time. And this potential, obviously the pandemic had the consequences it had, and I'm not suggesting that necessarily the deaths would have been any less if scientists had been more open, but we would have at least been able to contextualize it and understand what was really going on. It's also the most unscientific, anti-science thing to do, and a danger to the credibility of science, to do cover-ups, because the whole way in which science and scientists have their authority is that they are telling the truth. They are explaining the world to those of us who don't get it, in ways that are truthful and the ways that are based on fact. And so if you have kind of a political sort of distortion of that trust and that relationship, that has really bad ramifications for the future of science. One of the things that we've talked about several times on this podcast is the reasons why a particular form of anti-vax sentiment has come about. We've kind of mused about why it is that people have gone to such extremes, or even actually why it is that people who are, reasonable are expressing sort of relatively anti-science views about the nature of the vaccine. And, all of that comes from a mistrust of science, which doesn't just fall out of the sky, and not all of it is necessarily unfounded in fact. And if you have top scientists now being revealed to have playing sort of geopolitics with the truth, and actually jumping the gun and assuming that publics can't handle the truth, that's one way for conspiracy theories to
there's actually a bit
of more founded.
There's a bit of a pipeline as well. I'm sure people have noticed this, between people who got really into lab leak quite early and the kind of anti-vax stuff, and you kind of sense in which they were vindicated on this one, which, as most people have conceded now, is a plausible explanation. We may never know really where this thing came from, but still, lab leak is one thing. Where that then kind of urges them on to other things, because they told us this was a conspiracy theory explicitly. It's a conspiracy theory. That's what people were told. You couldn't post about it on Facebook. The spread of this was suppressed. Really serious stuff. And it gets people's minds wondering, what else they might be covering up. So it just entirely backfires, definitely. And there's been some very prominent sort of public figures, YouTubers, broadcasters already, I'm not going to name any names, who started on one and then moved to the other very obviously. And I think there's definitely something in that. Yeah,
definitely. And you've hinted at the other aspect of this. It wasn't just, high-profile scientists who tried to quash this theory. It was big tech. And this has been one of the big kind of censorship scandals of the past few years, where we saw, big tech change its mind on whether it's plausible, in line with the views of the President of the United States, this time happening to be Joe Biden, a favourable president, unlike Donald Trump, who they kicked off. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is extraordinary. You had Facebook banning people for something like 30 days if they mentioned the lab leak. You had, everyone knows that you couldn't move for using the word COVID or something like that for Twitter and YouTube or anything, to slap a warning on you. It wasn't just big tech. You had large newspapers like The Guardian and others publishing stories that said anyone who talks about the lab leak is a liar and is a conspiracy theorist and this is terrible. Shut up about it.
Yeah.
Don't talk about it. And so there was a kind of justification then for big tech censorship because it seemed like the whole world had agreed that this was something that wasn't to be talked about. And as we know, what happens with big tech censorship is not that it fixes all the problems and everyone suddenly thinks the right thing, but actually that in this case, actually, it wasn't a conspiracy theory. It turns out that is something that could be founded in truth. But those kind of underground theories proliferate.
Yeah.
So the sort of idea that big tech censorship is, as we've said so many times on this podcast, is some kind of a salve or the right way to go about ensuring that society has the right kind of views never works even in practice.
It's also quite clearly, like in some respects, like state censorship by proxy now.
Yeah.
It's so clear, or at least officialdom. I mean, you had at the beginning of the pandemic, Facebook and YouTube and all these other ones basically defer either to national health authorities, to the governments, to the World Health Organization, and that basically anything that went against their guidelines or information would be taken down. Early on in the pandemic, Facebook was taking down events for kind of anti-lockdown protests or just protests full stop, I think, in line with particular states' kind of social distancing rules and stuff, which again, a lot of kind of civil libertarians kind of raise the alarm about, because again, you have this kind of weird hand-in-glove relationship between state and big tech. And I think particularly in the last couple of years with the pandemic, as well as some of the other kind of Trump-related stuff, the sort of fusion between very powerful people in politics and big tech censorship, that relationship has become incredibly cozy. It's not to say it's coordinated, it's not to say someone presses a button and all the rest of it. In many cases, it's big tech kind of going to these organizations and saying, tell us what we need to do. But that relationship is really, really dodgy. And I think does give the lie to the idea that this is just a simple thing about these private companies making these particular decisions. It's a lot more complicated than that at this point, I think.
Definitely. So is it racist to call a black person eloquent? Cambridge professor Priyam Vadagopal says that this is a way of dismissing the views of black people. Tom, you've written about this quite funny conflagration. Do you want to describe it?
Yeah, so Dr. Gopal, as she likes to be referred to, which is there's a story in that, who's this sort of professor of post-colonial studies at Cambridge, has become like a bit of a kind of phenomenon online as someone who is often kind of indistinguishable from a parody account, I think it's fair to say. And this is her kind of latest comment, which is that, as you say, it's sort of a microaggression, I guess, in the lingo to refer to a black person as eloquent. It was in response to a piece in the Telegraph by one of her colleagues at Cambridge called David Abulafia, who's a historian, and it was about the Colston Four and the acquittal that we talked about on the podcast last week. And at one point he referred to David Olusoga, who's also a historian, who gave this kind of expert testimony at the trial, and he said he was eloquent. So first of all, Dr. Gopal just wanted to criticise the article itself, but then again just found a way to basically imply it was racist. It, again, as you're saying, it was a kind of way of saying, what you're saying is very impassioned and all the rest of it, but it's still, not serious. Exactly, that kind of thing. And it's just part of this weird subgenre, I think, of of sort of woke anti-racism, which is trying to suggest that even complimenting ethnic minorities is a form of racism. It's this really sort of wacky end of it. But at the same time, I think it's, in the full Dr. Gopal, we see that, often when you talk about these ideas, these kind of quite balmy identitarian concepts, people kind of say, well, who actually believes that? Professors at Cambridge University, it turns out. So a silly little story, but revealing in some respects, I guess.
Ella.
That's the funny and depressing thing, is that I was trying to go back through Dr. Gopal's tweets to find the original one that was talking about her use, the use of the word eloquent. And it was taking me a very long time. And it's a story that's only just happened. There's reams and reams and reams of tweets from her about so-and-so said this about me in the tabloid press and blah, blah, blah. This person did this. And you do think, how is it okay that this Cambridge Don is spending this much time on Twitter talking about herself? And the reason why it is important is because Dr. Gopal has been here before in relation to controversies around microaggressions or claims of racism. I mean, as you joked about initially, Tom, infamously, she claimed that porters at Cambridge were racist because they were calling her madam rather than Dr. Gopal, and that this was an expression of, the fact that the help couldn't even address you properly was an expression of white supremacy and racism. she then went on to, just about, I know this sounds slightly boring, but I think it is important. She then went on to later in all these tweets I was reading say, well, I didn't call him racist. So I wasn't saying that the use of the word eloquent was racist, actually. But why would you need to call someone racist when they defend a slave trading statue? So really what she was saying was, it wasn't actually the fact that this professor had called David Olusoga eloquent, and everyone knows that David Olusoga is eloquent. He has loads of television programs. That's part of his success as a historian who's become popular. But it wasn't that. It was the fact that this professor was criticising Olusoga and indeed the Colson Force political position in wanting to pull down the statue. And it's that kind of slippery nature of identity politics, where everything gets labelled as this sort of slight, as this insult to your very, the thing that is part of an unmovable part of your identity, your skin color, your sex, the way you look, whatever it is, your disability. And actually what they're doing is attacking your politics. And it's cowardly, because what she should do is come out and say, I disagree with what you are saying about this statue, and I think you're wrong on this. And that's what you would expect Cambridge professors to do. But no, it has to be on the level of the kind of personal, which is both degrading for the professor who's been now labelled as a kind of racist, but also degrading for herself and indeed Olusoga, because it suggests that they themselves have no grounds for their position.
Yeah. It sounds like a caricature, but it is just, I disagree with you, therefore you're a racist at this point. It's just ridiculous. I mean, especially ridiculous in this case, because there's many people, in possession of access to Google found out very quickly, is that Dr. Gopal herself had referred to Benjamin Zephaniah as eloquent in an article 3 years ago. It's just utterly ridiculous. But it is just one of those things, I think, which just sort of demonstrate how much this, what can feel like quite a ridiculous ideology, has just permeated even our highest institutions of learning. It's just sort of like second sense to a lot of people now. And that's one of the things that's so depressing about it, especially because what they're pushing is just as you say, it's very kind of petty, and it is just using these things as just sort of cudgels most of the time, just to take down people you disagree with. But again, it just shows how much that very divisive, that very sort of racialized sort of outlook really genuinely permeates the intellectual elite at this point. There's a bit of a battle going on about it at Cambridge and elsewhere, but it's still very much in place, definitely. And it's not just a few crazy students.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.